What's up everyone, it's Patrick from Purple Park Studios, and today we're going to be doing some destruction inside of Blender. First thing we're going to do is I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to add in a cube. I'm going to hit G, Z, and 1 just to move it up, and then I'm going to hit Control A and apply all the transforms so that the origin point is right here at the 3D cursor. So now I'm going to hit S and Z and scale this up on the Z, S and X to scale out on the X, and then I'm going to just hit S and scale this whole thing up a bit, just because I find that in Blender the rigid body simulations work a lot better when things are scaled up bigger. I know it's not accurate to real world scale. Maybe one day that'll get changed, but for now it is what it is. So I'm going to hit S and Y and just scale that in a bit on the Y axis. So now we're about ready to start fracturing this wall, but before we go ahead and start fracturing this, we're going to make our lives a lot easier by using a free add-on that comes with Blender. So if you don't have it enabled, you can go up to Edit and Preferences, and under Add-ons, search for Cell Fracture, and it should pop up here, and just make sure the little checkbox is checked, and then you will have successfully enabled the Cell Fracture add-on. So before we go ahead and start using the add-on, we need to do a couple things to tell Blender where to fracture this, because we don't want to fracture the entire wall, we only want to fracture a portion of it. So I'm going to hit 1 to go into front mode, and I'm going to click on this little annotate tool here, the annotate pencil. And if I was just to start drawing now, you can see if I scroll in 3D space that it's not actually stuck to the mesh, it's like kind of just in this general area, and we don't want that. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. We can go up here to our active tool workspace settings and change it from 3D cursor to surface. So now wherever we draw, it will be stuck to the surface. You can see here it's on the top and wrapping around, and that's what we want. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo those because I don't want my marks there. So I'll hit 1 to go into front mode, and I want this plane or this cube to fracture near the center. So I'm going to draw a circle for the initial place where the initial fracture will take place, and then I'll just draw a few more circles in between here, and this is just going to tell Blender to really fracture it up in here. And then I'm going to draw a couple lines for some cracks going off, some cracks breaking off from the initial place of impact. And you can make this as detailed or as not detailed as you want, but for this tutorial I'm going to leave it like that. Looks like a little kid drew a sun on a piece of paper. So I'm going to hit 1 to go into front mode, and we're ready to fracture this thing. So I'm going to select my cube, and I'm going to go up to Edit and Menu Search, and you can go ahead and search for Cell Fracture. Should say 3D Viewport, Objects, Quick Effects, Cell Fracture. So go ahead and click on that, and we'll get these options here. Now for this tutorial, there's only 2 things we need to worry about. It should come up for you as own particles, but you just want to make sure that annotation pencil has been checked, and that will tell Blender to fracture this cube based on our annotation marks that we drew on the cube. Next, we need to take the source limit, and you can make this whatever you want. I'm actually going to just make this 100 for this tutorial, but you can increase the number, and that will just be essentially how many times Blender fractures, like how many pieces you get. So I'm going to leave it at 100 for the tutorial, and that's all we really need to do for this tutorial. So next I'm going to hit OK, and you can see Blender goes to work, and it's fracturing the cube up. Alright, so Blender's done fracturing the cube, and you can see we have this look like that we get when 2 meshes are colliding, and that's because if we go up here, you can see that Blender has fractured the cube, but in doing so, it's created a whole new cube. So our original cube is just, we can just hit X and delete that. So then that will take care of that issue for us. So now so before we go ahead and start adding the rigid body simulation to this cube, I'm just going to go ahead and grab my annotation pencil and go to eraser, and I am going to erase these annotation lines. So now we're going to add the rigid body effects to this cube, but we don't want the entire cube to blow apart. So what we need to do is I'm going to go into X-ray mode by clicking this up here. I'll hit 1 to go into front mode. I'm just going to select the areas that I want. So like that looks good. I'm just going to hold down Shift and deselect a couple of these points that I don't want to break off, just the bigger chunks. All of the smaller chunks I want selected. So right now there is no active object. You can see that all of these objects are just like a dark orange. So I'm just going to select this one down here, and you can see it turns a lighter orange. That is our active object, and that is important. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a rigid body simulation to this active object here. So I'll go down to my physics properties and I'm going to hit rigid body. And it's important to note before we go on that you still have all these other objects selected. So the light orange one is the active object, but we have all of these other objects still selected. So that's going to be important. If you haven't done that, you're going to want to make sure that all the objects you want to blow apart are selected, and then that you have this one active object. So on our active object, we've added the rigid body. We're going to go down here and change it from convex hull to mesh. And the only other thing we need to change is if we go down to deactivation, or I'm sorry, it's under dynamics, you left click the arrow, check deactivation, and then left click that arrow, and then just left click start deactivated. And this will essentially tell Blender that do not destroy these pieces until something else with a rigid body on it smashes into them. So now that we've added this rigid body effect to our active object, the rest of these objects still don't have the rigid body effect on them, and they all need to have that. So instead of going through one by one and repeating that process and adding the rigid body effect, that would be insane and take so much time. So there's a quick way to do this. We can go up to Object, go down to Rigid Body, and hit Copy from Active. So remember, this was our active object here that we added the rigid body effects to, and the rest of these in the darker orange were selected. So now Blender has added the same rigid body effect we added to this to all of them. So if you can see that it works by clicking on it, and now you'll notice they all have rigid body on them. Now these over here that we didn't have selected, they do not have rigid body on them. But they need to have rigid body on them, but not the same type, because we want these portions of the wall to hold in place. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of the pieces on the outer edge here. And this last one here is my active object. So I'm going to hit rigid body, and I'm going to change this from active to passive, and also from convex hull to mesh. And that is just, passive is just going to tell Blender that these pieces can take part in the simulation, but they can't be affected. So if something bumps into them, it'll bounce off and interact in the simulation, but they're not going to blow apart when something collides with them. So now that the rest of these are still selected, we can go up to Object, Rigid Body, and we can hit Copy from Active. And while we're at it, let's right click with these still all selected and just hit Move to Collection, New Collection, and we're going to call this passive. And then just hit OK. So then we can go up here and left click and then scroll down to the very bottom of all the little fractured pieces that we have. And holding down Shift, select the very last one, right click, move to collection, new collection, and we'll call this fractured. And the reason that we're doing this is, one, it just makes it a little bit easier up here to see, and also if we need to select all these objects instead of going back in, going to X-ray mode and trying to select them all, now we can just go up here, select our collection, right click, and hit Select Objects. So now all these objects are instantly selected, and we want Blender to calculate their mass so that when they blow apart randomly. So we can do this easily by going up to Object, Rigid Body, Calculate Mass. And you can see you get all these different options. So if you're working with, gravel or glass, you can calculate a simulation for that. I'm going to go ahead and select concrete for this tutorial because I'm kind of envisioning this wall as like a block of concrete, and Blender has calculated the mass for each one of these pieces. So if you look over in your rigid body effects here, the mass, if you click on each one of these, is different. So this one is 1,000 or 14,465. This one is 8,029, and so on and so forth. And you notice that some of the smaller pieces weigh a lot less than some of the larger pieces. So now would be a good time to save the project. And if we go ahead and hit play, nothing happens. And that's because, if you remember, we have these little pieces here that we've selected to start deactivated. So we need an object to smash into them. So let's go ahead and hit Shift A, and we're going to add a UV sphere. Move it up there, and maybe scale it up a good bit like that. something like that. And I'm going to just move this back on the y-axis like that, just about here. Maybe scale it down a little bit. And we want to go ahead and add a rigid body to this sphere as well. And we're going to leave this active, but we just want to change from dynamic to animated. And this is going to tell Blender that not to use this object unless it's animated, and then it will become active in the simulation. And we might as well change it from convex hull to sphere. So I'm going to hit I and add a location, rotation, and scale keyframe. And then I'm going to go ahead about, I don't know, 10 frames and just move it to about here. And then I'm going to hit I, location, rotation, and scale. And then we can just right click with our sphere still selected, hit move to collection, new collection, and we'll call this sphere. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just hide the sphere from the render and viewport for now. And if I go back to frame 1 and I hit play, you can see that the sphere has blown through. And let me just turn the sphere back on so you can see the sphere has blown through the wall, and it doesn't look too bad. So one thing we could do if we don't want these pieces to fly, you know, if we don't want them to go flying so crazy, we can select our sphere and just move it a little bit closer to the wall, and then hit I for location, rotation, and scale. And then if I hit play, you can see that now the pieces don't fly so far. And you can refine this as much as you want. So maybe we're going to literally put it here. Hit I, location, rotation, and scale. I play, and now you can see the pieces, they don't fly off as far. You can mess with this a step further by selecting your sphere, and under mass, you can actually lower the mass of it so it won't have as much of an impact. So I'll do something like, I don't know, 0.004, and then let's replay the simulation. So now you can see that it was, you know, the pieces didn't go flying off as harshly there. And if it's not getting all your pieces, you just want to make sure that when your cube is hitting the wall, that it is big enough, or I'm sorry, when your sphere is hitting the wall, that it is big enough that it is going to hit all of those pieces. Then hit I, location, rotation, and scale. And now you can see all the pieces get blasted away there. So you could really spend a lot of time just refining and playing with different settings in the rigid bodies. Mainly on, you know, on your pieces here that are being impacted, and on your sphere that is impacting. You could definitely play around. You know, you could even add in Shift A, add in, there's force fields. You could add in all kinds of cool stuff to just really take the simulation to the next level. We're not going to get into the advanced editing in this tutorial, but I hope that this tutorial was helpful in getting you started on making a simulation of your own. And if you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. And don't forget to hit subscribe. And thanks, guys. I will see you in the next tutorial.